Hey everyone, today we read the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Sokon, which belonged to Judah. They encamped between Sokon and Azekah in Epistemi. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. And a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the army of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. As we read earlier, we know that the Philistines, they were much more powerful than the Israelites in terms of their equipment. They had all the weapons. Israelites didn't. And this Goliath, he was 6 cubits and a span high. So if he would come to the church today, he would be as high as the pillar or on the roof, the ceiling. So, can you imagine if I stand beside Goliath, my eyes would be about his belt level. So, you just imagine, it must be so shocking, scary to see such a tall giant. And he had a bronze helmet on his head. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Only the coat was 125 pounds. So some sisters are not even that heavy. And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. And his spear was like a weaver's beam. And he had an iron spearhead weight 600 shekels. That's about 15 pounds. Just the iron spearhead was 15 pounds. And the spearhead was made of iron, and the spear may be made of bronze. And then a shield bearer went before him, taking the shield. And just imagine the picture. With a shield bearer in front of him, and Goliath was a giant. And then he cried to the armies of Israel. This enemy was not just very tall and powerful. He had very heavy and powerful weapons. And then he came. He said, "Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. If I win, you serve me. If I lose, I serve you." It sounds just, but with such a posture and height, all the Israelites were terrified. No one would dare to go to fight with him. all the Israelites were afraid. Saul and all Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid. No one dared to face Goliath. So that was the first section, the background of the story. That means Israel faced a very difficult challenge. And then David met up with Goliath, verse 12 to 15, another section describing why David was not beside Saul. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years. In the days of Saul, the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The name of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So there must be a time that David was on holiday. He went home, and but then because of the battle, he returned. And here it's mentioned that Goliath was there dividing the army of Israel for 40 days. 40 days is a long time, and you can imagine how patient God was to wait for the vessel to rise up. And verse 16, and the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. That was a long time. And then verse 17. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of the 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So 40 days was a long time. Even Jesse was worried about his sons. And he must be wondering, how was the battle going? How come there was no news? So he sent his youngest son, David, to the battle to see if they are all right. So verse 20, so David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to this camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was a champion, the Philistine of Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to divide Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So all the Israelites were very afraid. They all fled from Goliath. And the king said, whoever can kill Goliath will be rewarded with the king's daughter. So everyone knew about it among the Israelites. But every time when Goliath came out to defiled the army of Israel, everyone was terrified. So when David arrived, he spoke to the man who stood by him, saying, verse 26, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So he heard the news, but then he just wanted to clarify, so what would be the reward? And then he said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So you see, only David could see that he belongs to the army of the living God. And only the others cannot see that God is with them. They could only see the giant Goliath, but in David's eyes, Goliath was just an uncircumcised Philistine. So you see, they have really different perspectives. They saw the same Goliath, but the Israelites saw a giant, and David saw an uncircumcised Philistine. They saw the same thing, muscular giant, but they have different interpretation. And it's same for us today, brothers and sisters. Everyone see the same problem, but if you have different interpretation, you have different faith and perspective, and we have a totally different outcome. And that's worthy to reflect for us. Verse 27, "And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, "Why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And so the people told David what they heard, that whoever kills Goliath will be rewarded by Saul's daughter, by money, and he become a relative of the king. But David's oldest brother was angry when he heard David said such a thing. "Why did you come down here? Whom you have left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know you're proud. You just want to see what you can do." I guess this oldest brother didn't like David. Don't know why the whole family didn't like him. But David said, "What have I done? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. David ignored this brother. And then he just said again, "Who is this Philistine? Why would he divide the armies of the living God? And why is there no one who go out against him?" And he said, so people heard about this, and so verse 31, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." So some people reported what David said to Saul, and then David said to Saul, "Don't worry, I will go fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." So thought that, oh wow, that was a mighty man. And then he was surprised. "Oh, it was you? It's you? You cannot go. You're still so young." And that may be why Saul did not bring David along with him to the battlefield. Saul thought that David would not be able to overcome Philistines, not an equal opponent. Verse 34, but David proclaimed, and he said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defiled the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the power of the lion and from the power of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So David said to Saul, "I have always encountered a lion or bear, and I used to save a lamb out of its mouth, and I killed the lion or the bear. So God saved me from these wild animals, and God will surely also save me from the hands of the Philistines." So David was not just imagining and just had faith in God, but he's experienced God's power and help. He could defeat the lion and bear. So was Goliath more powerful, or a lion or bear more powerful? It's not easy to strike down a lion or a bear. And so Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Actually, Saul did not have a choice. The Israelites will lose anyway, so if you say that you have killed a lion or a bear, then okay, you go and try. There was no choice, must risk it. Verse 38, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistines. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistines looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give you your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." So we see Saul try to give David his armor, but David could not really wear them. They were too heavy and too big. It was more hindering to David. So David took all this armor out and off, and then he just chose for himself 5 small stones from the river brook and put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch, and he had his sling in his hand. The shepherds had nothing to do, so they will always be practicing the sling. And so David used his own weapon to face Goliath. And Saul wanted to give David his armor, but David was not used to it. So sometimes when we serve God, we don't need to think too complicated. We don't think that, oh, I cannot do it, I'm not good at it, I don't know how to do this, and I cannot do that. It doesn't matter. Just like David, when he was used by God, God is not asking him to give what he does not have. If we put Saul's characteristics or what's special on David, that would not work. David just had to live out his being, who God has created him. If he's a shepherd, just be a shepherd. They just need to choose 5 stones. He could live out his true self so that what's special about him can be lived out. God can use any ordinary thing, ordinary man, the most ordinary shepherd or stones. God can accomplish great things. So it's not forceful, it's not by compulsion. It can be natural. So David just used what he was good at. Just 5 stones, and the sling actually doesn't look like that he was going to the battlefield. And so Goliath despised him, looked down on him from his appearance, that he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So he looks more like a musician than a warrior. And David didn't even have a weapon, a formal weapon, except the sling and the stones. So Goliath said, "Am I a dog? Are you treating me like a dog?" And so the Philistine cursed David by his gods and threatened to kill him. The next section, then verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistine to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So we can see the faith of David, that Goliath was relying on the sword and the spear, the javelin, but David relies on God, and he knows that only God gives the victory. So David was actually not just talking to Goliath, but all the Israelites. God really wants all the Israelites to know that it's all about God. And every time God intervened to help give the victory to Israel, And many times God helped Israel. So why would the people rely on themselves this time? Again, we see that Saul and Israel saw a giant, but David could see God. A key of victory is God. The battle is the Lord's. Verse 48. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistine fell along the road to Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So the stone hit through the skull of Goliath, and so it was like being hit by a gun, a bullet of a gun. So Goliath died immediately. He couldn't strike back. He just fell down to the ground. And so David killed him in an instant. He didn't have a sword, so he took the sword of Goliath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And the Philistines saw that the champion was dead in a few seconds, that he was defeated, so they all fled. They must be so shocked and terrified. Goliath was like playing with David, like playing with a monkey. Although they thought even if they would fight, it would take some time. They never thought that Goliath would lose. But as soon as they started, they lost greatly. They were not prepared that they would lose. And the Israelites, they were so excited their faith came back. And so they all shouted and pursued the Philistines. The Philistines were not prepared. And so they just fled. And so the Philistines chased after the Philistines as far as Gath, which was the hometown of Goliath. And all the Philistines were defeated greatly. And the Israelites even plundered the tents. And David took the head of the Goliath back to Jerusalem and put his armor in his tent like a memorial. And so that all the Israelites could see that God had given them great victory. The last section, verse 55 to the end. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, Inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" So David answered, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." So Saul saw that David attacked Goliath and won. So he asked Abner, "Whose son is this you? Who's this?" Why would he ask him? Saul knew David. David always played music for him. So no one can really believe this picture. So is this the same person, the same young man who played the harp for me? Isn't he like a musician? It was hard for Saul to believe. So just to confirm if this really is the David or no, or just someone who looks similar. And Abner, his commander, said, "Oh, I do not know. I make a vow, I don't know." No one could imagine how that would be possible. David was just playing harp. That's the one they knew. They never saw his courage is very different from his appearance. Looks very gentlemanlike, but then he was such a warrior. So the king said, "Ask about this. Who this man?" And David took the head of Goliath and went to Goliath, and went before Saul, and Saul asked, "Who are you? Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered him. So in this chapter we see that David was chosen by God. What he did was very different from the Israelites. His faith was very different, and that was why God chose him. And everyone saw the giant, but David saw God. Saul relied on the weapons. Goliath had his weapons, but then David came against Goliath with his faith. So, who do we look at today? The giant? Are we like Saul and the Israelites, or do we stand from another position and look from another perspective like David? And David, when he looked at Goliath, he just remembered the army of the living God. People were fearful, but David saw that the battle belongs to God and God gives the victory. May the Lord help us so we can have faith and serve the Lord with what we have. Amen.